Welcome, everybody. I see that we've had a couple more people join us. My name's Greg Margolis. I'm the Director of Special Services for Summit. It's hard to believe that I'm actually 3/4 of the way through my first year in the district. It's amazing how time flies. But I've really enjoyed my time here so far, getting to know our great staff, um, parents, students, and all of the programs that we have to offer. I want to thank our members of the Special Education Parent Advisory Committee who helped us kind of narrow down the focus this year for the programs that we wanted to present to everybody. And this is the culmination of some of that work. So actually, before I introduce our presenter, I just want to mention one thing. So everybody is muted, but at the end of the presentation, we'll put up a Q&A portal so that if there's any questions that you have, you'll be able to type that into the Q&A box, and then we'll address those as they come. So without further ado, I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Lori Catania, neuropsychologist, and I'll let you take it away.
Okay. Thank you, Greg. So I'm going to first start by sharing my screen. And let's make sure that we have this. So Greg, just let me know that you're seeing what I'm seeing, okay? Okay, do you see my presentation?
We're good.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, so I'd like to start by having everyone think of a situation or an incident where their child or their children evoked in them this reaction, where we kind of shook our head and asked ourselves, what were they thinking? So I'm going to share a personal story. I have 3 children. My middle son is a sophomore at the University of Richmond, and he is a great kid, smart kid, kind kid. But a week in his life, last Christmas break, so not this past Christmas, but the Christmas before, a week in his life looked like this. On Monday of that week, we had a virtual court appointment because my son and his friends took a trip to Morristown, and upon getting out of their Uber, found an alley to relieve themselves in, got a summons, which resulted in his having a $500 fine on Monday. On Wednesday, he and I took the trip to Richmond for a Thursday morning court appointment for a speeding ticket that he had gotten. And in Virginia, speeding is a very serious offense, which resulted in another $500 fine. So in the matter of a week, my fairly intelligent 18-year-old son had racked up charges of $1,000 for less than intelligent choices he made. This is one of many stories that I could have shared regarding times when my children have evoked this type of an emotional response. But it's not uncommon. There are many different occasions where we can find incidents of children or adolescents doing somewhat dumb things. And here are some stories that I found headlines of. So things from teenagers taking a selfie with a squirrel who later attacks that teenager, to individuals hiring someone to run them over so that they don't have to take an exam, to teenagers acting like they are the Kool-Aid man, if anyone remembers the Kool-Aid man, and barreling through their neighbor's fence. So it is not uncommon for kids to do somewhat impulsive and not entirely well thought out behaviors. But what is it that causes them to act in these ways? What skill set is currently insecure, or are they currently lacking, that then results in these types of behaviors? And that is the focus of our presentation this evening. We are going to be focusing on executive functions, specifically understanding the what, the where, the when, the why, and the how. So hopefully by the end of tonight's presentation, you are going to have a sense of the answers to some of these questions. What are executive functions? When do they develop? Where are they located in the brain? Why are they important? And how can we help children improve them? So for some time, in fact, almost 200 years, there has been reference to a skill set or skills that we need to complete tasks purposefully. We didn't collectively call this set of skills executive functioning until the 1970s. So, very broadly, they are defined as mental processes that allow us to perform goal oriented tasks. They include specific skills like initiation, planning, organization, reasoning, inhibition. And even while we recognize some of the areas that are included, there's still some lack of consensus how to operationally define executive functions. So there have been further attempts to categorize or specify them. One such attempt is to look at them in comparison to what we call hot executive functioning skills and cold executive functioning skills. So, hot executive functioning skills are ones that tend to be a bit more emotional in nature. They're more motivationally significant. So, those are skills that we might perform to reach a reward or to obtain an incentive, to possibly avoid a punishment or avoid an adverse response. So while hot is more emotional and motivational, cold is more cognitive. And those are the ones we're going to be focusing on in this presentation. Both of these skill sets develop during childhood, but the cold tend to develop more steeply than the hot. If you were to perform a search on the internet and look up executive function, 9 times out of 10, you are seeing it described by these 3 core executive functions. These 3 fall under what we would identify as cold executive functions, the ones that are more cognitively driven. So they include working memory, inhibitory control, and cognitive or mental flexibility. So I want to spend a little bit of time detailing each of these. So working memory. Working memory is the act of actively taking in information, holding on to it for the purpose of utilizing it as needed. We have 2 types of working memory. We have verbal working memory, which is when we hear something, and we have visual working memory when we see something. So an example of verbal working memory might be that you are on vacation somewhere and you ask for directions how to get to a local museum. And someone might say, you go up to the coffee shop and you take a right, 3 streets down, you'll see a church and you take a left, and so on and so forth. And then your ability to hold on to that and then use it to help you find that location is an example of verbal working memory. In the classroom, this might look more like, okay, let's all put away our reading books, take out your math workbook, open to page 52, and let's do odd problems between 10 and 30. That's an example of verbal working memory. Visual working memory, again, is where you see something that you're holding on in memory. So here, an example in real life might be you're reading a book and the doorbell rings or your phone buzzes and you tend to that, and then you come back and you remember where you were in your book and also what you were reading about. In the classroom, this might look like students are completing an essay, and then a visitor comes into the classroom to deliver a message. So they have to look up from their essay, attend to the message that's being delivered, and then they need to go back, finding where they left off, and also what was it they were writing about. So those are examples of working memory. Another core area of executive functioning is inhibitory control. And what inhibitory control is being able to control one's attention, behaviors, thoughts, or emotions. It is resisting the urge to do what we want to do and instead doing what we should be doing. There are two areas that fall under inhibitory control. There's self-control or response inhibition, and then there's also interference control. Self-control is where we are controlling our behaviors and emotions. So this is the opposite of impulsivity. It is thinking before you speak. So it is being in a classroom and there's a conversation being discussed and waiting your turn to share your opinion or your thoughts, not just blurting that out. It also involves task completion. And what task completion is not only being able to start a task, but being able to see it through until it's finished. And I have a lot of parents that will remark that their children are often able to start something, but it's challenging for them to sustain their performance until that task is completed. So that's an example of self-control. The other area that falls under inhibitory control is interference control. And this is more controlling our thinking. So it's the idea of selective attention. So in a classroom, if kids are divided into groups and they're working in groups, it's being able to attend to what's being delivered or discussed in my group and not pay attention to all of the groups around me. Or it's not paying attention to sounds you might hear outside of the classroom, things that are happening in the hallway. It's also being able to resist our own internal distraction. So while I'm engaged in active dialogue with another individual, say even in that group situation, it's me being able to not have unwanted thoughts come in, like, what is it I should be doing after school? Or my excitement about plans I might have for something I'm doing later in the day, or thinking about other responsibilities I have. It's keeping those out and being attentive to the information that is currently being presented. So we have working memory and we have inhibitory control. The third core area of executive function is cognitive or mental flexibility. What cognitive or mental flexibility is being able to shift set, not getting stuck in a certain pattern of thinking. So if a child is completing a math problem incorrectly and someone offers them some input how to modify and change how they're completing that task, for them then to be able to adopt that new perspective or approach to complete the task. So it's being able to shift and not perseverate. This is the opposite of cognitive rigidity. In addition to being able to shift your set, it's being able to think outside of the box, not always think in standard or uniform ways, but to be able to come at something from a different angle, to look at it creatively. These three skills, inhibitory control, working memory, and cognitive flexibility, work in tandem with one another. So they don't work in isolation. And it's the combination of the three that allows someone to be effective in their overall executive functioning. So collectively, the combination allows someone to sustain their attention, to be able to shift, to weed out distractions, to not respond impulsively. Additionally, it's the combination of these three core skills: working memory, inhibitory control, and cognitive flexibility, that allows an individual to engage in higher level executive functioning skills like reasoning, problem solving, and planning. So basically, they're acting like the foundation to us then being able to engage in higher level conceptual thinking and application of executive function skills. What we need to appreciate when we are talking about executive functioning skills is we aren't born with a level of full competence in these skills. They develop over time. And here you see an illustration of that. So you can see from birth through our teens, there's a very steep curve there. And if we think about what kids like behaviorally, what they look like behaviorally, this makes sense, right? You could remember being in a grocery store and kids are yelling or grabbing out things or tantruming. At a young age, they don't necessarily have the ability to regulate their skills, their behaviors, their responses in ways that allow them to be more controlled. But over time, the expectation is that they can do that. And what you can see here is these skills aren't fully developed until an individual is in their late 20s. So you can see they peak at about 25, 29. So what I want to now transition to do is talking about what specifically executive function skills look like in childhood through adolescence. So in the early school year, so it's not that we're born without any executive functioning skills at all. In infancy, we can see that children do have some goal-directed behaviors, right? They want something, they reach for it, but they're limited. And so what we see in children who are young of age, between the ages of 2 to 3, is that instead of referring to them by that 3-factor model, instead of referring to executive function skills in this age group based on working memory, inhibitory control, and cognitive flexibility, it makes more sense to refer to it as a 2-factor model, which is working memory and inhibitory control, because that's what we're seeing elements of early on in between this age range. In fact, even there, they're often blurred, and it's even hard to distinguish working memory from inhibitory control in this age group. What happens in this age group is they do tend to be very rigid in how they review something. So if you look at the picture to the right of your screen, you can see that it is either a duck or a rabbit. Well, for a child within this age grouping, they see it as one or the other. They can't transition their thinking to be able to then move from seeing as a duck and then a rabbit, or vice versa. The other thing we see in this group is that they tend to be insecure in their planning skills. So if you've ever played a memory game with a toddler, you'll see they're somewhat ineffective in their approach. So when you play a memory game, and I'm sure we all remember having done this, you lay out cards and then you'll flip them over in an attempt to find a pair. And what you'll do, or what we would know to do, is when you're going for your next attempt, you first turn over a new card and try to match it to a card that you have previously viewed. For a child in this age grouping, that's not their approach. They often start by flipping over a card that they have already seen. As kids age, just even between 4 and 5, we see dramatic improvements in both inhibitory control, and we start to see greater elements of cognitive flexibility. So in this group now, they can see it as a rabbit or a duck. The other thing they can do is, with regards to their inhibitory control, research has shown in kids this age, if you offer them a group that is less, with the understanding that that results in a reward of more. So, for example, you can give them a pile of M&Ms that is smaller and a pile of M&Ms that is larger. And you teach them by responding to the smaller pile, they actually are rewarded with more. They can learn that. What they can't learn, so they're able to learn reactively. They cannot, however, learn proactively. So if you change that task and you said, if you respond to less now, you get more later, they're not able to do that. If you respond to less now, you get more now, they can, but they can't respond to, if you choose less now, you get more later. The other thing that kids in this age group have challenge with is being able to negate or being able to understand relevance. So if you give them a memory task where you take, say, for example, some toy, say a truck, and you hide it to the left behind something or to the right behind something, they could find it. If you take that toy, that truck, and you now put it in a box and you hide it to the left or to the right, they have challenges in finding it. The box is irrelevant, but they can't easily be able to differentiate or delineate what is important for me to know here. So while we're seeing improvements, there are still many skills that are insecure in this age group. A common task that is used to measure executive functioning, in fact, this is a task that is used worldwide to measure executive functioning in kids, is known as the hearts and flower task. So what kids have to do here, in phase 1, which is the congruent phase, they have presented to them hearts, and they have to respond to where the heart has been presented. In the second phase, which is the incongruent phase, they are presented flowers, and when they are presented flowers, they have to respond on the opposite side. And then the last phase is the mixed phase, where they're presented both hearts and flowers. So then if they're presented a heart, they have to respond on the side of the heart. If they are presented a flower, they have to respond on the opposite side. And what research has shown is that children are able to do the first phase. The second phase, we see improvements in accuracy around generally between 4 and 7. And then we see improvements overall in this task between 6 and 8. When we are looking at how it measures to executive functioning in kids, in younger kids, we're looking for their accuracy. We're looking at how well overall they can complete this task. As kids get older, their efficiency in executive functioning is measured by how fast they can complete the task. Because the idea here is that speed of processing is something that we also are expecting to improve over time. When kids move into middle school, we see improvements in all of those 3 core executive functioning areas: working memory, inhibitory control, and cognitive flexibility. So with working memory, it might be a task where they are shown a grid, and the grid has certain areas that light up on it, and then they have to identify what was the pattern that was lit up. For inhibitory control, what they've been asked to do is there are tasks where they're shown a stimulus to the right or the left, and they have to look to the opposite side. So if the stimulus is presented on their right-hand side, they have to look to the left and right, and vice versa. So the idea is they're inhibiting being pulled towards looking towards where the stimulus is being presented, and instead looking in the opposite direction. So we see improvements across the board. We especially see that planning and organizational skills are developing rapidly within this age group. They're still not there, so there's still skills that they are clearly lacking, but it's not what we think. What's meant by that is this. In this age group can sometimes be interpreted or thought of as lacking motivation or being uninterested or sometimes being defiant or lacking understanding of some concepts. And what we have found is that's not necessarily the case. It's more so related to the areas of executive functioning that remain insecure, specifically inhibitory control. So here, kids have challenges distinguishing relational terms or how material is being presented to them. So I'm going to give you some examples here. So let's say in an English assignment, students are required to do a subject-verb agreement. And some of the questions may look like this. The dog of my neighbors was or were barking. The boys on the team was or were doing well. What happens in that case is there's confusion, natural confusion, as to, am I supposed to be matching to the first subject or the second subject? So there's confusion about how information is being presented, not necessarily with the task of knowing what a subject and a verb agreement would be. Similar situations might be seen in a math example, where you have something like, Matt is 15 years old. He is 10 years older than Jenna. How old is Jenna? The older in that problem suggests an addition of something. So there's a confusion again in deciphering what is being asked of them, not necessarily in understanding the ground or foundational concept that's at play there. As we move into high school, we see, again, improvement across the board, most notably in planning skills. So kids during this age will become more efficient, more systematic, and more organized. We also see an increase in their speed of processing, which is an expectation that we have. Here, we are still not there. They're not always making the best decisions and choosing to potentially urinate in an alleyway, like my son. But here, the thing is more so than other ages, there are external influences that are having an impact on their brain. Things like their sleep cycles, their involvement with social media, and alcohol use. Those three areas all have a very profound effect on the area of the brain that is responsible for executive functioning. Which brings me into discussing what areas of the brain are involved in executive functioning. You can't have a presentation on executive functioning without talking about the brain. So I'm going to make this, or attempt to make this, as understandable and simple as possible. So we have two hemispheres in our brain. We have a right hemisphere and we have a left hemisphere. Those same hemispheres make up 4 lobes of our brain that you see pictured for you here. So the blue area is the frontal lobe. Then behind it, red parietal, purple occipital, and yellow is the temporal. When we are talking about executive functions, we are talking about that frontal lobe. So if you were to put your hand on your forehead, right behind your forehead is your frontal lobe. That area is primarily responsible for executive functions. Even more specifically, is an area of the frontal lobe known as the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is very heavily involved and very active in planning and judgment and reasoning and things of that sort. Within each of those areas are billions and billions of cells that are known as neurons. And what happens is the way that we produce any behavior is those cells talking to one another. So over time, as our brain matures, those cells can talk more efficiently to each other. Well, why can they talk more efficiently to each other? Like when we saw the curve of executive functions developing, what does the brain look like during those patterns? The brain is maturing. And what that means is if you look at the extension off of the cell, you see that it is covered in that orange, yellowish little substance. That is something that is known as myelin. Myelin works in the same way that insulation works on an electrical cord, right? So think about plugging in an appliance. You plug in a toaster, you plug in your computer, whatever it may be. The electrical message has to get from the outlet to the appliance for it to function. The same thing happens in our brain when the cells are communicating. It is an electrical message that travels down that what's called an axon, and then when it gets to the end, releases a message to be received by the next cell. And in doing so, that cascade of communication results in behavior. Well, our cells get covered in this myelin over time. And as the cells are covered in the myelin, they become more efficient. The frontal lobes are the last part of our brain to myelinate. They are not fully myelinated. The cells are not fully insulated until we are in our late 20s. So that's why the skills for that area of the brain don't fully come online until the related cells are mature, in this case, myelinated or insulated. Another thing to appreciate about the brain, so if you look to the right of your screen here, that is the frontal lobe. The way that our brain evolved is the oldest part of our brain is the lowest level of our brain. And you could think of our brain as being 3 floors, right? The lowest level is something called the brainstem. That is what is the most primitive part of our brain. It connects us to other species. It is responsible for unconscious behaviors, things like respiration and heart rate. As we move up, that area that appears like green and orange, that's called a subcortical area. That's some behaviors like emotion and motivation, aspects of movement. And then we move to what I've already described is the frontal lobe. What happens is there's communication that happens between all of these areas. But let's go back to talking just briefly about those 3 influences on the teenage brain: alcohol, sleep, and social media. Let's start by talking about alcohol. So now appreciate in the adolescent brain, that frontal lobe is not yet fully developed. However, it's still the reasoning part of our brain. So whatever capabilities we have for reasoning are housed there. What happens when someone drinks alcohol is those areas of the brain are suppressed. Their activation decreases. However, the more primitive parts of the brain, that area that's green in color, which is things like aggression, sex drive, um, those areas are sending messages to the frontal lobe. And when we're not drinking, the frontal lobe can say, help us reason through a situation. Like, I shouldn't be getting in a fight with this person. I shouldn't be doing this type of a behavior. But when the teenage brain is under the influence of alcohol, that reasoning center is suppressed, but the primitive center is not. So then they're acting on these more or less regulated behaviors, and they're not having the part of the brain that's typically active to say no, not a good idea. Even though it's still insecure, it would still be saying those things. So that's where alcohol affects the teenage brain. When we sleep, we do many things in the brain. We consolidate our memories, and we have like a flushing system. It cleans out and prepares us for full use again the next day. Teenagers should be getting somewhere. It's recommended by the American Academy of Pediatrics that individuals between the ages of 13 and 18 get between 8 and 10 hours of sleep, which is often not happening, particularly in older teenagers and teenage girls. And sleep deprivation has the most vulnerable effect on that prefrontal cortex. With social media, what's happening with social media and the teenage brain is that when our cells do something over and over again, they become what's called habituated. They become used to it, and it becomes more of their common behavior. And part of what's happening with teenagers and their amount of social media use, in fact, more than half of teenagers report that they are almost constantly, almost always using some form of social media or internet use. What's happening by doing so is we're rewiring parts of the brain, and we're training the brain to have a shorter attention span, to be a little bit more reactive, to not necessarily sit with something and recognize the full consequence of those behaviors, but to act a bit more impulsively. All right, so that talks about the brain's involvement, but why are we talking about executive functions at all? What is the importance of these skills? Research has shown that they are critical for success, not only in school, but in life in general. So they have often been referred to as the cognitive toolkit of success. So they're essential for things like physical health. We see improved sleep, we see improved mood, we see a reduction in premature aging when someone has executive functioning skills that are efficient. They also help us with social relations. So they allow us to make and keep friends. They carry into adulthood in social relations. So people who have efficiency in their executive function skills are associated with greater levels of marital harmony, lower levels of divorce. And executive function skills are also responsible or also predictive of academic achievement and school performance. In fact, executive function skills predict school readiness more so than IQ and entry-level skill. So you have children that are coming into, say, kindergarten. You have a child with a high IQ. You have a child who is coming in being able to read at a basic level, and you have a child who is to the level that is expected, is regulated in their behaviors, in their thinking, in their emotion. The child that is the regulated child, the one that has the highest level of executive function, that child is predicted to have a improved level of school readiness than the other children. Executive function skills also predict success in school thereafter, and they work to protect children against learning disabilities, most notably math learning disabilities. So what might it look like for a child that has challenges with executive function? Well, you might see a child in the classroom who is disorganized, who cannot easily initiate, who is disruptive or poorly regulated. And what happens is if those skills are not tended to, if they're not addressed, if there aren't active attempts to improve them, they grow larger. And they often then lead to a negative self-image and maladaptive behaviors. Poor executive functioning skills in childhood are linked to things like higher rates of smoking, unplanned pregnancies, dropping out of school. They're also characteristic of some of the disorders you see listed here. It does not mean that every child who is diagnosed with ADHD, ASD, which is autism spectrum disorder, developmental disorders, or learning difficulties, are going to have pronounced challenges in executive functioning, but more often than not, there is an association. So as a neuropsychologist, what I attempt to do is to assess these skills, to see what a child's capability in those areas like inhibitory control, working memory, cognitive flexibility. So we might complete tasks like some of the ones you see shown to you here. So look in the top left-hand corner of your screen. This is an example of an inhibitory task. So you can see the first line, the words are printed in their accurate color ink. Blue is blue, orange is orange. Look at the second line. Here, the colors are printed in a different colored ink. And what the child is tasked to do is to say the color of the ink and inhibit their overlearned behavior of reading the word. What you see in the lower left-hand corner is a task of cognitive flexibility. So what the child has to do here is match a separate card to one of the features included in these cards using feedback, just telling them right or wrong, but not why right or wrong, to match cards. And then the matching principle changes and they need to shift their set and then match according to the feedback they're now given. You also see at the top of your screen an example of a strategy task and an example of a planning task. What you see in the bottom right-hand corner is an example of a questionnaire that is given, because what we will often see is this. Children can complete these tasks well in the structured one-on-one test setting where it is often minimal in terms of distractions, but yet that's not what is being reported in the actual environment. So what these questionnaires do is allow us to get a sense of what their executive functions look like in the real environment. And these are completed by the child if they are of a certain age, by the parent, and by a teacher. And what they are looking at is the child's ability to regulate their behavior, their emotions, and their thinking. So then we have a sense of whether or not the results we're finding in testing are consistent with what is being seen out in the real world. And then we look to see the why. If it is consistent, then we understand that at an inherent level, they're having trouble with these skills. If they can do the task with us in testing, but they're not able to apply those skills in the real environment, then we look for what's the breakdown. Where's the disconnect in the match? Is it that there's too many distractions? Is the teaching approach maybe not consistent with their overall learning style? So we use this information to determine whether or not a child has the skills and whether or not they're able to exercise them appropriately in the real environment. With all of that said, we know that there are benefits to children having intact or secure executive function skills. And we know that there are ways for us to directly attempt to improve those skills. And here you see some ways that we can do that. So there's cognitive training, physical activities, school programming, mindfulness practices, neurofeedback, and then some miscellaneous other approaches. I'm going to detail for you the 3 most effective ways at improving individuals' executive function skills. The first is cognitive training. And so what cognitive training is brief direct training using computerized games. So we have computerized and non-computerized. Obviously, the non-computerized is not using the computer to help with the development of these skills. With computerized, the most successful program that has been used is something called CogMed. And I want to show you, I'm hoping that this works. I'm going to show you an example of a CogMed program for a preschooler and then one for a child who's slightly older. So this is an example of, okay, so this is an example of a CogMed task that would be used for a preschooler.
Lori, is it just visual or is there supposed to be sound also?
Oh, you don't hear the sound?
No.
Oh, okay. No, there is sound. I'm hearing the sound. So, oh, sorry. So what it is they're showing them a series of, so you saw that you could see the picture, Greg?
Yes.
Okay. So there's a little sound that comes along with it, a little like squeak that the figure is making. And then the child in the pattern that they were shown, the activation of those little fuzzy balls, they then need to hit in the same pattern. And then I'm going to show you this. I'm thinking that it might not also work with the sound, but let's see. Right, do you hear that?
No, there's no sound.
Okay, so what it is here is they're showing them a pattern of the squares lighting in an order, and then they need to hit the same ordering that they saw it being hit in. And it also makes a sound when it's being activated. Okay. What those tasks show an improvement in, which makes sense, is working memory. So the computerized cognitive training, the one area that it's shown to most significantly improve is working memory. What non-computerized cognitive training is doing this, but on a more interactional level. So actually playing memory games with an individual, or strategic board games like checkers or chess or various card games. So one way that we can enhance executive functioning skills is cognitive training. Another is physical activities, specifically activities that include what we call open motor skills as compared to closed motor skills. So closed motor skills are tasks that are stable and predictable. Open motor skills are ones that are unpredictable, where the individual needs to make frequent adjustments based on their identity, their position, and their speed. They're things like soccer or basketball or hockey, where you change from an offensive position to a defensive position, where you need to think while you're also using your physical skills. They also include tasks that involve interceptive skills. What interceptive skills are, where we need to coordinate dynamically with an object in the environment using our body or some equipment. So these are things like pickleball is now all the rage, tennis, boxing. So the open motor skills tend to be better than closed motor skills in developing executive functions because they require thinking as you're completing the task. In a similar way, mind-body activities improve executive function skills. And most notably, activities that are like Chinese mind-body practices, like Taekwondo or Tai Chi, or something called Bajuanjin. I don't know if anybody has ever heard of this, but what it is it's a series of 8 or so exercises. They're gentle exercises where kind of you move yourself in space, and they promote flexibility, strength, and circulation. These types of activities are better than just simple aerobic activity like walking and running, where you don't have to give much cognitive thought. And then the last most effective area in improving cognitive executive functioning is school programming. This is where embedded into the curriculum are strategies that enhance executive functioning, most notably inhibitory control. So school programming is most associated with an improvement in inhibitory control. And here I have a few examples of programs that have done just that have incorporated executive functioning programming into the curriculum. So one is known as the PATHS program. It's promoting alternative thinking strategies, targets 5 conceptual areas: self-control, emotional understanding, positive self-esteem, relationships, and interpersonal problem-solving skills. Tools of the Mind is a program that focuses on child-centered, dramatic, play-focused activities. So where individuals pretend to be somebody and they act accordingly. A teenager has to be an executive of the company. What decision-making policies would they put in place? Then the Chicago School Readiness Project is a Head Start project, where they found that by teaching children early on, there was a definitive benefit to improvement in their executive functioning skills. So teaching them executive functioning or incorporating these areas into the curriculum early on saw an overall improvement in their executive functioning skills over time, as well as their academic achievement. What has been found across the board with school programming is that it tends to be more of a beneficial or positive effect if the activities are child initiated or guided rather than direct instruction. Rather than just being told what to do, they are part of the process of actively determining what needs to be done and how it could best be done. Ultimately, the goal of incorporating executive functioning development into school program is that these programs are going to challenge children, but they're also reduce their stress, they increase their confidence, and they also help them with emphasizing social skill development and character development. So then, which of those work best? So since I can't see or hear any of you, I'm going to tell you. Of those three models, the area that has been found to be most effective in improving children's executive functioning are the physical activities with incorporated mindfulness practices like Taekwondo, Tai Chi, things of that sort. The second most effective is school programming. And then the last area, appreciating that these overall are still the three most effective, the last area is non-computerized cognitive training, because the non-computerized allows for an interactional component that ends up being beneficial. What we find is this: in general, these practices need to be incorporated for a certain amount of time over a certain duration. So specifically with working memory, the instruction needs to occur for 30 to 40 minutes. What was found is that less than 30 minutes was not nearly as effective. So 30 to 40 minute intervals, and they have to occur for a period of 6 to 10 weeks. With attempts at improving cognitive flexibility, activities should be occurring for a period between 75 to 120 minutes over that same amount of time. Regardless of the modality, there have been some consistently important considerations in the delivery of instruction attempted at improving executive function. One is the quality of the trainer. So whether it be a teacher or a parent or a mentor, that person needs to make the activity enjoyable. They need to make it personally relevant, and they need to actively communicate their belief in the participant's ability to achieve success. So that's one necessary criteria. Another necessary criteria is that while it should be supportive, there has to also be attention on fostering autonomy in these activities. So when kids have feelings of self-control, when they feel like they are part of the decision making and how something is occurring, it allows them to be more reflective. It allows them to evaluate the behavior more critically, and then to be able to modify that, to know how to improve it. The last criteria is that we have to be careful not to evaluate the behaviors in children with our adult brain. So we are all most of us, are at a point where we are over the age of maturation of our frontal lobes. So what happens is we have developed inhibitory control. We have hopefully developed cognitive flexibility. We look at a child who is misbehaving and we think, how can they not be better behaved? How can they not be better regulated? Because our adult brain is interpreting it accordingly. We have to appreciate where they are in their developmental course and that they might not be capable of regulation at the expected level. Here are some additional ways, some additional strategies that can be used to help kids develop executive functioning skills. In essence, what we are trying to do is we are trying to act like their frontal lobes, because the more that we have them engage in behaviors that utilize that area of the brain, the more habituated the related cells become, the more efficient they become in being able to appropriately, for their age, we need to recognize that, because an 8-year-old is not going to be able to be fully regulated. So for their age, exercise executive functioning skills. So scaffolding. Scaffolding is basically breaking down skill sets into a graduated fashion, starting simple and becoming more complex over time. Establishing routines and schedules, developing plans and management strategies, using checklists, breaking down tasks into manageable goals, and setting rewards based on completion. So on a delayed completion, if I do X, Y, and Z, then I get the reward of such and such. And then the bottom, you see encourage participation in activities requiring strategy and regulation. We talked about that being sports and physical activities, but it's also true of activities like musical training. Then we see relaxation and meditation techniques, executive coaching, which is only going to be helpful in kids of a certain age. This isn't going to work for kids that are young. And then lastly, after strategies have been attempted, if people are needing additional assistance, there's consideration to supplements and medications. Overall, what I hope that I have conveyed is the importance of us directing attention at developing executive functioning skills in children, because we have seen research has shown that a child's performance on executive functioning tasks is often more predictive of their academic success than things like IQ. And that, when we look at what their executive function skills look like, say, even in a 4-year-old, studies have shown that executive functioning skills in a 4-year-old could be predictive of math and reading at the age of 21 and the odds of completing college. So there are definite long-term impacts of us directing attempts at developing these skills in children. And that is the conclusion, if anyone has any questions.